Hello everyone and welcome to a new video on my YouTube channel Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez and I'm coming to you from Martin in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. Welcome to a new edition of the podcast, The Written Page, which today will be a videocast. And our guests today are John T. Maddox and Thomas M. Stevens, who have recently written a dictionary of Latin American Identities that has just been published by the University of Florida Press. It's hot off the presses, just came out a couple of weeks ago, really, in 2021, and it has over 900 pages with English language definitions of 21,000 terms related to race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality used in Latin America over the past 5 centuries, not just in Spanish, but also in Portuguese, French, and their Creole varieties. John, like yours truly, is an alumnus of Vanderbilt University, and he is currently an associate professor of Spanish at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He is the author of Challenging the Black Atlantic, the New World novels of Zapata, Olivella, and Gonsalves. Tom Stevens is a professor of Spanish at Rutgers University, and he is the author of the Dictionary of Latin American Racial and Ethnic Terminology. I had a very pleasant chat with John and Tom, and I started the chat by asking them to reminisce about how they became interested in the Spanish language and Hispanic culture, and what it was that attracted them about the Spanish language and the culture of Spanish-speaking countries.
I had a fantastic Spanish 1 teacher in high school. I started learning Spanish as a junior. When I started, I knew the word taco, and that was about it. My reference for Hispanic culture was Speedy Gonzalez and the people I met at the supermarket where I worked. But I had a tremendous teacher who was very dynamic. I later learned that she graduated from Vanderbilt too, but she's very creative, and she was the first person to take me abroad. She also taught me introduction to literature. And so this is in Alamo, Georgia, which is you have to give references to usually 2 other towns before you get to one that people have heard of. But she always had the attitude that even though we're out in rural Georgia, that we are part of a big world, and that learning another language is a way to do that. And then when I to learn about that world and be a part of it. And then when I came to college, it fascinated me and excited me to learn that I could study both literature and that foreign language. So I didn't have to choose between those 2 sides that inspired me in that great teacher and just in my own personality. And I just stayed with it. And I learned Portuguese because I was living in a Spanish-speaking dorm where everybody spoke 3 languages, and I didn't want to be the one guy that didn't speak a 3rd language. It worked out quite well because I met my wife, Luciana Silva, and now I speak Portuguese every day to her. So I've been a very lucky person, and this dictionary is kind of a product of that trajectory.
You know, that sort of reminds me, I kind of see myself reflect on that because I haven't been born in the northwest of Spain, really close to the border of Portugal. I actually learned Portuguese as a kid, and that, you know, the fact that I was able to just travel maybe 35 minutes away, and I was in another country with not necessarily an incredibly different culture, or, you know, landscape wise it wasn't that different, but it was a different language, and it was like traveling from Tennessee to Kentucky, but you are in another a country all of a sudden where they have different customs in a way, and they have a different language. How about you, Tom?
A very similar trajectory. And I had a great teacher in high school. She had found out that she actually had only had 2 years of college Spanish. So she was staying one day ahead of her students in the class. And we were all floored by the fact that she was so wonderful, and we didn't know that she was a wonderful teacher and a great actress. Miss Guthrie was special. She's still around in South Carolina. In fact, I grew up in a little town called Woodruff, which is, as John says, you need reference for everything. Greenville, Spartanburg are the nearest towns that are of any size, and it was a way of escape. Anton, it was something that other people didn't do well. So I escaped into my own world quite often by doing Spanish verbs in my head. Got to college, and of course that was a completely different world, and happily it was a different world, and I too fell in love with other Romance languages and learned Portuguese along the way, and dabbled in a little French and a little Italian, kind of like most people do when they're in Spanish and Portuguese, and here I am at Rutgers.
I always tell the students, that in my classes here at the university, that one of the things that learning a new language does is that it opens doors to, different cultures, different realities, things that you wouldn't be able to access if it were not for the language. And that is why I always tell them that it is important, and I encourage them to travel as much as possible. How much traveling has been a part of your experience in learning different languages? First, Tom, and then John.
Yeah, my first experience abroad was a junior in college, and time when I drove from South Carolina to Monterrey, Mexico. It was a foolhardy thing to do, but I didn't think I could afford to fly. That was the only experience I had out of the country until 1987, when I went to Brazil. I really didn't go any other place after that, strangely enough. And in fact, I've been to Brazil more than I've been to any Spanish-speaking country. But of course, since then, I've made up for lost time. Spain and Mexico and Puerto Rico and Costa Rica and you name it, places that. So travel has always been a part, and I feel comfortable going. I used to carry a little dictionary with me, Anton, I haven't carried a dictionary with me in 30-something years. There's no reason to have a dictionary because it was a crutch that I never used. And so travel is a huge portion of it. Certainly even my later life, it was a huge portion of what I've done. Absolutely incredible.
John?
I always rhetorically ask my students why they need to learn Spanish or really any other language when we have Google Translate. And there are a lot of answers to that question, but the most basic one is independence. And that's what Tom was just talking about, is even if we have the highest technology, the best, most efficient technology in terms of just mere semantics, it's awkward and it still feels distant, and it makes you dependent on something, if nothing else, a Wi-Fi signal or G5 or whatever. And so it gives you a great sense of independence and a sense of freedom to wander and learn. I've had the chance to travel a lot. I think because I'm a small town boy in a lot of ways, I'm fascinated by big cities. I'm fascinated by being in places that are very different for me. So I've been to Spain 4 times. I went twice as a student and twice as a professor. And with each of those trips to Spain, I go to several different countries in Europe because, Anton, like you were saying, the geography lends itself to that. You have a great infrastructure for it. You just hop on a train and go, or you get a cheap flight and go. I studied in Mexico for a month as an undergrad. We did like classroom observations. It was through the Department of Education at the University of Georgia. So I got to visit a one-room schoolhouse in Mexico. Divine people out there, very, very welcoming. I've been to Brazil 3 times. I was married in Brazil. So I got to meet all of my in-laws at once. That was a lot of fun. And on my side in Brazil of the ceremony, you'd look and see 200 people or so from her family. On my side was my Portuguese teacher, Susan Quinlan, and Kechi Lira, a telenovela actress. So that's one of those unique experiences you can have studying abroad. And just having a global life that comes with studying different languages. Conferences have taken me to Colombia, to Central America. I spent a semester at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, the UPI, they call it. It's very dear to my heart. And because of that connection, I've gone back several times, and I got to meet several authors that are working on Puerto Rico. They're Black authors. They're working on representing Black people in Latin American, in Puerto Rican history. And as you can tell, I'm kind of addicted to traveling now. I love wandering the globe. I've been to Cambodia and India just because they're there, right? In the case of Cambodia, my wife went there for professional reasons. I tagged along. India, I had a friend who got married there. So I just love meeting new people and seeing new places.
Mm-hmm. And I do see that Latin America is a constant in both of your lives. You've been, there many times, and you have studied the culture, different aspects of the culture and the languages. And of course, I want to talk about the Dictionary of Latin American Identities today. But before we do that, just a quick question, because John and I are alumni of the same university, Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, not too far from where I am right now in Martin, Tennessee, about 2.5 hours away, just about. But John teaches at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and as Tom just said before, he's at Rutgers University. And I wonder, how did you two meet, and how did you begin working together?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah. We met at one of these conferences I was just talking about. We met through the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese, which is a big tent Spanish and Portuguese organization. So you've got people who teach kindergartners, along with people who teach at PhD courses. So I've always loved that about it. And you really never know who you'll meet. In my case, my first year as an assistant professor, I go to Denver to the AATSP conference, and I go to this guy's talk because I study the African diaspora as my primary field. And he's going to talk to me about race and ethnicity. So I decided to go to his talk. I get excited. See, I'm studying Manuel Zapata Olivella. Manuel Zapata Olivella is, without a doubt, the most important Black writer of Colombia of the 20th century. Perhaps, well, I would say definitely one of the greatest Black writers of Latin America of all times. And he was fascinated by folklore, and he wrote this fantastic novel. It's gigantic. It's kind of, if you can imagine a Roots from Latin America, it's the loose equivalent of that, but it's called Changó el Gran Putas, and it basically invents a new language to talk about the new world, or at least that's the intent. And so instead of saying African diaspora, like we would today, you'll say Muntu. Muntu means man or humanity, right? And so the Muntu comes to the new world, and they combine with all these different cultures, and they evolve over the course of history. So that's an example of the kind of terminology that he would use. And he takes Muntu from the Bantu language. And so if I'm already working with writers like this, like Manuel Zapata Olivella, Ney Lopes in Brazil does the same thing. He has a dictionary of different terms, an encyclopedia of different terms. And so I ask Tom Stevens, the guy who's presenting on race and ethnicity, if he's considered these sources. And he says, well, let's look at this source from Zapata Olivella. Let's talk more about this project. We talk about it. We say, well, we're reading the same people. We have so much in common. John, why don't you take the torch? Yeah, he had already written 2 editions of his dictionary. And so this was my chance to join him on a fantastic project, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So ever since 2015, the Dictionary of Latin American Identities has been a part of my life.
It's evolved, right? My friend Mary Macris at the University of Louisville actually met John on a bus coming into town that same day or the day before. And she said, you really should go to this guy's talk, which we did go. And that's a little backstory for the fact that we actually decided to work together almost immediately. John is the right person for the evolution of this project, Anton. It started out as a dictionary of Latin American racial and ethnic terminology, and it's evolved into something which includes all of that, but adds more stuff, more material, and we're hoping even more as we expand more into the French American terminology. But John is the right age. I will be 70 in November, which I'm not ready to kick the bucket or retire, but it's time for somebody younger to take over the project, because it's not something that ends. These are things we talk about all the time. I've just been inundated with suggestions to watch Jordan Peterson on YouTube of late, and some of his things, I don't know whether you know Jordan Peterson, but he's a Canadian psychoanalyst, and some of his stuff sounds so reactionary that I just want to scream, and then some of it sounds like he makes complete sense, right? I guess that's the sign of a great philosopher. But I hope that we evoke something a little less crazy than that. We're trying to present terminology, crazy is not the right word, something a little less provocative than that, I guess I should say. We want to present this terminology in ways that academicians and people just out on the street who have a question could look it up and say, hey, there's what this term means or that term means. And that's the point of this dictionary. Mm-hmm. That's the point. We hope to take it digital, but we'll see.
Well, John has written extensively about Zapata Olivella. Challenging the Black Atlantic is the book that he published about that. And of course, Tom has worked on this Dictionary of Latin American Racial and Ethnic Terminology, which seems to be the forefather in a way, or the forebear of what you have been working on now, which is, it just came out 2021, not too long ago, really. And this is why I got in touch with the two of you to talk about this. It's the Dictionary of Latin American Identities, published by the University of Florida Press. Hot off the press, as hot as it can be, really. And you know, in looking at such a daunting project, because we're talking about more than 900 pages, lots of terminology, lots of work, I wonder, how did you two carry out the research for this monumental work? And also, what difficulties, if any, did you come across along the way?
Well, the nature of identity is intersectional, right? Kimberly Crenshaw is the pioneer for that. But I think that it really doesn't take too much theorizing to understand that men's experiences with race and ethnicity are probably going to be different from women's, all right, vice versa. And we've got more than the binary notion of identity. So we have basically four axes that we're working with. So we've got race and ethnicity, right? Race, typically something written on the body, versus ethnicity, which is something that's more cultural. It's everything else, if you will, that's associated with a group. And then you've got gender and sexuality, right? So we've got gender, which again is the body, and sexuality, and rather, you've got gender and sexuality. You've got gender, which would be a cultural and political creation, and you've got sexuality, which would relate to desire and orientation, these kinds of things. because all of these things intersect, all right? And even that, right, if we're going to think like Deleuze, this is going to be like a machine with parts that connect to and Guattari, everybody leaves out Guattari, but the machines with parts that connect to different other areas of the self and the groups that we belong to. So the research is going to intersect with religion, it's going to intersect with history and all these different things that create us. And the methodology is about as postmodern as you can get as far as finding sources. So we read a lot in history. We read a lot in linguistics. You've got Cecilia Valdés there. So you even got literature. El costumbrismo is a great source for these kinds of things. And then you've got some more daring sources. We're not ashamed to cite Wikipedia because that's where people are communicating. We're not ashamed to cite a chat room or a conversation between friends. So we've got oral sources, we've got digital sources, we've got high art, we've got the most rigorous history alongside people having conversations in real life because we move through the world in our identities in all these contexts.
Mm-hmm.
One of my most interesting, I think one of the most interesting citations in the dictionary is a reference to a cab driver in, was it in Manaus? I think it was Manaus, who gave me some terminology I'd never heard before. And I think the only reference is Manaus cab driver or something like that. Talking about esoteric and non-specific. It truly floats like that. But we've cited our sources. I mean, people can go look them up. If we've cited the wrong page number, it's possible. There could be errors like that because we're dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of dates and pages and stuff. So yes, there could be those errors, but I've checked them more than once.
I've checked them more than once.
Correct, but I've checked them more than once.
So I see that the research was not just research based on books or digital sources, but also some sort of field research from what you're saying, right?
If you will, field. Were they real interviews where we needed IRB approval? No, these were true conversations where people would offer you stuff. Hey, Tom, have you ever heard of Muñeco de Oro Sus? And no, I've never heard of that. And so that appeared in the dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that kind of thing.
I've talked to friends that are debating is Latinx the same as Latine,
mm-hmm.
right? If we're going to get into inclusive language, where I've worked for years now with an immigrant group called Adelante Alabama, and they're a very LGBTQ affirming environment, and so all of this terminology has flesh and blood to it. And so they, if you think about immigration, which is a big part of the dictionary as well, immigrant populations in the United States, some of the most vulnerable people that are immigrating to the United States are LGBTQ. So if you've got a trans person, a non-binary person, then you're going to need to work with the terminology that best fits them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. And I think, when you look at the work itself with over 21,000 terms related to those categories you were talking about, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, race, etc. It is amazing to see how much information there is. And, when you tackle a work like that, my question is, what is the process by which you select certain terms for inclusion, but you don't include certain other terms? What kind of process do you follow to make up a dictionary like this?
The goal of excluding is not our goal. So the goal is to be as inclusive as possible. Mm-hmm. Naturally, we want to have the rigor of understanding the context, understanding the speaker, understanding these things. And of course, if we have sources to cite them, I mean, if we're working with John Lipsky, if we're working with Armin Schwegler, we have to give our colleagues credit for these things. But there is not we're not looking to exclude. Now, if if we're looking at a word, for example, quemar petróleo, right? That's referring to a white person having sex with a black person, right, in Cuba, all right? The word petróleo to mean oil, that's not going to be an entry in the dictionary, right? But that phrase would be, because it's related to both sexuality and to race.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be alphabetized under Q and not P.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, that kind of answers my question, because what I found about the work is that it's just so wide ranging, and we're talking about Spanish and Portuguese and French, and also the Creole varieties of those languages, as in the different geographical areas that we are talking about. And so when we think about language, and when we think about different languages that sort of coexist, or at least exist in the same space, or in a similar geographical space, and we think about the idea of identity, the way that you approach it in this work, I wonder, is identity understood in different ways in different languages and within different countries, or are there always traits that are sort of the same no matter what country or language you're talking about?
I think you have to keep historical and at least regional, if not national context in mind at all times. So I'm not inclined to think that there is an essential notion of Blackness or femininity or of queer identity that transcends all of these different barriers that humans put up for themselves. Because empires, we'll just start there, empires expand by creating enemies to conquer. And then once you conquer an area, or as you're conquering an area, you create categories for different people. And so power is always a part of creating language, and the different forces at work are going to be contextualized. Now, we're working as linguists here. This is a linguistic text. And so the goal should be an approach that's as objective as we can make it, given our context, while we're still aware that all of these different forces of power are still going on in our context today. But I wrote the introduction to show that we are aware that empires have influenced our notions of race, and in many ways have created our notion of race, because these are ways to justify something like enslaving another person, taking land away from another person, keeping a person confined to the domestic space as opposed to allowing them into the public sphere because they're a woman, for example. And so I think that context is definitely something one should always keep in mind. But in the introduction, I tried to show the patterns that have emerged over history, which include the history of the conquest, as well as nation building, as well as the realities of today.
Exactly. You have to realize that Europe was coming out of the feudal times, and what basically happened was they may have left it behind somewhat in Europe, but they transplanted it to the Americas, not North America, but certainly anything influenced by Spanish, Portuguese, and French, and that for several hundred years affected the way that those societies developed. A very feudal kind of construct, not in the original sense, but certainly that kind of, the encomienda was a feudal, the tributo was a feudal. I mean, these are things that hark back to when the paupers had to pay the princes. It's the same idea. They made the poor people, the slaves and whatever they had, pay the princes, right? So these constructs come straight out of that kind of nation building, if you will, if that's really kind of what you're talking about. I was watching recently, or reading recently, about the quadroon ball in New Orleans. Do you ever know about the quadroon ball? Quadroon ball was an annual, or maybe more than annual, bal, where they had dancing, where the white guys came and found themselves a quadroon, mistress.
Mm-hmm.
Could they marry them? There was always that tension of whether they could marry or not. But here's an example of where this whole the old colonial idea that lasted into the late 1800s and early 1900s is still going on and still affected history and still affected people of color in Louisiana up into the 20th century and probably still today. So we're victims of our history, and sometimes we can't get out of it.
And we can look at things at a macro level, like we were just saying about empires, and we can look at it at a micro level. Your family, right? Family is a very important construct for understanding Latin America. And so the quadroon would be an example of an illegitimate family, illegitimate in quotation marks. I'm not attempting to recreate a racist construct. But oftentimes men would have children with these mistresses and create an illegitimate side to their own family that they could recognize or not recognize. And so all of these categories like sex and race that we all too often treat as scientific are very much the products of systems, of political systems, and those political systems include the family.
Mm-hmm. How often have you heard, John, of the darkest kid in certain family being called La Negrita or El Negrito? I mean, just the darkest person. And it may not be any darker. I mean, I don't know what I am, but it may not be any darker than me. Right?
And it's also incredible how those terms actually survived over the decades and the centuries, because being interested in jazz as I am, the concept of the quadroon that appears in a lot of popular songs of the late 19th century, early 20th century, some of which were recorded on cylinders and early records, and the songs of Stephen Foster, for example. And it's interesting how those things actually survive into the I wouldn't say the present day necessarily, but the early 20th century is not that far away from us, really, if you think about it. We're talking about 100 years ago. And something that I want to stress is that this dictionary is not a dictionary that deals with identity in Latin America right now alone, but it actually stretches back several centuries. So that's when I talked about how daunting I think this kind of project is, I'm talking about that, because thinking about just the topic of identities in the plural in Latin America is, if you're only concentrating on a specific moment, like it could be the present day or the last 50 years, if you're talking about the last 5-6 centuries, then it becomes almost impossible to imagine. But that's what the book is, and my question about that is it's the Dictionary of Latin American Identities, and it's plural. The title is in the plural. How can we justify that? Is it because the idea of identity is multifaceted, it has different faces? Is it because it depends on a lot of different aspects? How could you explain the title of this work?
I love the visual representation that they came up with for at University of Florida Press for our book, because it represents it quite well. It's like this Venn diagram of sometimes my interaction with others is going to be shaded more by my gender versus by my race, all right, or my race more than my sexuality, or any number of these combinations. So identity is something that is fluid and that's going to change depending on our context. So you used to hear about, or you still hear about in history discourse, Atlantic Creoles, right? Where they would use one category about their race or cualidade, or their casta or something like that in one context, and another aspect of it in another. And so that's why I chose the title and people liked it. But identities are in the plural here because sometimes it's going to be because of race or ethnicity. Sometimes it'll be gender or sexuality. And all of these aspects of power and creations of the subject and of groups are going to be in flux.
Exactly. This, as you pointed out, this project is an evolution from the time I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. So this is not, we didn't do this research in 6 years. What we've done in 6 years is do more research, probably a third more, John, I would guess, in the 6 years that we've been working together, and building on what was already there. Mm-hmm. It was published by the University Press of Florida, so there was no copyright issue anyway, and they'd already passed along the copyright to me anyway, so it's all good. But it's not for the faint of heart, and that's why you need people who are willing and interested to continue building on this. So that's what John did. It is about identities. There's a really good example of a video. Is it from the Americas video in which Raul Julia does the interview of the man in the Dominican Republic, or the interview is done with this man in the Dominican Republic who is he says, I'm mulatto, I'm white here, or whatever, but I go to the United States and I'm black, and they're very prejudiced in the United States. And then his mother says to him, you need to marry better. You need to marry up. Mejor de la raza, she says to him. And he's thinking, he looks down her and he doesn't even blink at that, not even realizing that they're talking across and over and under each other about the same topic in the DR. So it fascinates me. So this man sees his identity as different depending on where he is at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Right? So I'll give you guys an example. I randomly opened the dictionary to a page, and just in 2 pages, this is what we've got. Please excuse the term, oriental. Okay, so we've got a definition as a Uruguayan. It could be a person who is Asian. It could be a Venezuelan who's from the eastern side of the country. So there's an oriental on the same page with orejon, okay? Big ears, okay? So that's going to be a noble Indian who had enlarged earlobes, and various different names for that ethnicity. And they're going to intersect that with race, because they're racializing the indigenous people there. And on the next page over, we've got ocultar y pegar, the Spanish translation for tucking, to push male genitalia into the body. Okay, so these 3 categories, right, oriental, orejon, ocultar y pegar, or these 3 terms relate to 3 very different identities and different aspects of identity that can't be reduced to one another. So that's why it has to be identities.
And time periods.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Those examples that you just gave, John, make me think of how important do you think when as you were working on this project, the 2 of you were working on this project, how important from a linguistic perspective do you think the idea of metaphor is when it comes to dealing with all this terminology that you are working with and including in this dictionary?
I think that metaphor is central to it. I taught high school for a while, and high schoolers, what I always liked about them, more so than college students, is if they don't like something, they'll let you know immediately. And so they're very forthright people. And they'll often have frank conversations that maybe when you get a little older, you don't feel comfortable. And one student looks at another. The student asking the question is white. She's talking to a black person, and she says, "Why do they call you black if you're not black?" Because if you think about it, we just have different gradients of melanin, right? Mm-hmm. And the black student looks at her and says, "Well, why do they call you white if you're not white?" And so these innocent students that something just occurred to them to ask this question are making this discovery that race as a construct is metaphor. I'm not going to say it's an innocent metaphor. It's rarely, if ever, is an innocent metaphor. But it is a way to say that something is like another thing. And historically, sadly, it's been a negative association. And so people will try to transcend that through whitening, whether it's marrying a lighter skinned partner in Latin America, or whether it's financially and denying your origins. And only recently in the 20th century and really at the turn of the 21st century is race going to be a metaphor for something to be proud of, something that makes you unique, and something that makes you part of a greater community. So that's why I say in the introduction that race is not, terms for race, terms for gender can also be a way of creating new metaphors and creating new identities. So if you look back at all the brutality of the years that have brought us here, they have created a notion of Blackness, of gender, of queerness that can be made affirmative and can be used, those metaphors can be used for different ends, okay? And so that's the poetry of this, is creating new metaphors and new meanings for these old metaphors. And I brought up quemar petróleo. There's a lot of dirty jokes in this dictionary. I've never read a dictionary and laughed out loud while I was making it. Not all of them, I'm not sure, I'm sure are appropriate for a radio program, but there are a lot of metaphors for anal sex in here. I'm just going to go ahead and put it that way. And I think that the metaphors for anal sex, metaphors for sex with people of different races, metaphor for sex workers, there are a lot of words for prostitute in this book, because these are marginalized people, these are racialized people. And so metaphor is part of insulting others. That's one way we create and codify identities, a way of defending yourself against insults, and the sadism of humor, right? If you're laughing at somebody, a lot of times they don't like it, and that's part of the fun. And that's something that we do as humans. We create these categories, and they can be used to harm, and they can be used to create as well.
It really wasn't until I moved to the United States that I was ever asked a question about race in an official form, or that I even talked about the idea of race. Growing up in the northwest of Spain, that was not something that we, at least in those days, that has changed with immigration over the decades, of course, but it wasn't something that we paid a lot of attention to. Do you think it is because of only historical reasons, or are there any other reasons why here in the United States we pay so much attention to whether a person is one race or another, to the point where you have to define yourself by means of race in official forms and stuff like that?
Dividir y conquistar. That's the way I always look at it.
Mm-hmm.
That's
divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer. So let me before John can answer this question, I want to back up here about the issue of Spain. Spain's racism exists, and there are races in Spain. Mm-hmm. The Basques are seen as a different group. The Romani are seen as a different group, and they're mm-hmm. actually still called Gitanos in Spain, right? Mm-hmm. This is a big deal. But also, language is an issue in Spain. Mm-hmm. And Spain's race problems often have to do with the language that you speak. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with linguicism and not racism, right? Those things come up day after day after day in Spain. You walk down the street in Barcelona, somebody might not answer you in Castilian, Spanish. They might answer you in Catalan, mm-hmm. even though one doesn't understand Catalan. It doesn't happen as much in Galicia, from what I understand. It certainly wouldn't happen in the south or in the middle of Spain, but it does happen in certain places. And so those racism takes a different color, tone, if you will, mm-hmm. in those places. So it exists, it's just different, mm-hmm. right? So John, now you can answer the other question.
I'm speaking to you from Birmingham, Alabama, which was famously the most segregated city in America, and it continues to be segregated in many ways. And I think that the civil rights movement cannot be overestimated in its impact, not only locally, but globally. And so when you see figures like Martin Luther King and later the Black Power movement, you see people using the category, using the master's tools, if you will, to undo the master's house, right? So you use the Constitution, you use language, you use the identities that were created to oppress you to assume power. And in Latin America, you talked about your experience coming from Spain here, you have a different discourse on race in most countries, right? If you're talking about Colombia, especially in Brazil, Brazil was supposed to be a racial democracy. And that term was coined, some people don't know this, by Arthur Ramos, right? But it was popularized by Gilberto Freire. He became the face of this notion of harmony between the races that supported a notion that racism was confined to the United States. And so we in Latin America, in this case, are supposed to be united by our mixed heritage, our mixed cultures, our mixed bloods. And so if you have something like the impact of the civil rights movement in the United States in terms of civil rights, in terms of affirmative action, in terms of forming identity groups to assume power, assume rights, the people in Latin America typically are going to butt up against conservative interpretations of racism is a problem of the United States. Racism is not a problem of Latin America. And so that's where you get a term like afrodescendiente or afrodescendente, and working with the United Nations, different local groups in Brazil and in Colombia, for example, have tried to use human rights discourse as a way to assume power, assume agency, and make things better for themselves and for their communities. And so I think your experience of going from a place where people are not categorized in the same way here has parallels with today's debates over whether or not afrodescendencia is a product of the United States or product of Latin America.
I see. I think, when we're talking about identity, I often wondering, since we are throwing together people who may be personally very different, the idea of identity versus personality and that kind of thing. I wonder if what you think about the fact that perhaps identity could be sometimes simplifying or have the effect of simplifying certain things, as in, for example, or when we're dealing with politics, for example, or elections, like all African American people vote for a specific party, or all women vote in this way, or all Latinos vote in this way. Do you think that we run the risk of doing that when we deal with identity, and how can we avoid doing that?
I think that this dictionary helps us to understand that there is not a single Latino vote in the United States. Politicians seem confused when they hear that, and it's because of the history of racism and empire and all these things that we've been talking about, and gender, right? So you'll hear. I'll start out with race. If you have the immigration, for one thing, Latinx is not a race. Latino is not a race. Okay, we've discussed how different people enslaved one another and oppressed one another, and so both slave and master, if we're going to use those old terms, their descendants are here in the United States. Okay, so you've got indigenous people that are going to come that don't necessarily speak Spanish. Okay, you've got people from the Caribbean that are dealing with their own anti-Blackness. Okay, the Dominican Republic is famous for that because of the Trujillato, right, where Blackness is always codified as negative, and it's always codified as Haitian, right, because those are the enemy for that nationalist discourse. And so you have these different groups. If you've got the three different Hispanic Caribbean islands coming in, you've got Cubans coming in. Your first wave tends to be white. Then you've got the Mariel boat lift, where you have a lot more Black people, because you've got people from the marginalized sectors of society. And those immigrant groups are seen very differently. They were all coming in with a comparatively easy path to citizenship if you compare them to many Dominicans who were coming in without documentation. And you compare those two groups to Puerto Ricans, which, despite all of the issues of US colonialism, are US citizens. And so that documentation is not going to be an issue. And so you've got three very different groups, all three of which are very different from Mexican Americans, Central Americans. And so you've got regional differences, and these countries have their own internal differences regarding race, and they have different immigration statuses, different immigration stories that they have to deal with. And so then you throw in the element of gender to think about the Latino vote. You would think, okay, well, if they're minorities, if we're treating them as non-white, we would presume they would vote Democrat because of racial categories. That's not always the case. In many border towns in Texas, many Mexican Americans will supported Donald Trump, and there are many Cuban Americans that support Donald Trump because of these histories. And gender is part of that. It's no surprise to many Latin Americans to see a strong man or a strong man figure take power in a country, and for that to seem normal, and more normal than a woman assuming power in a country. So gender and race are going to be part of this.
Not to mention moral issues like, or religious issues like abortion and stuff like that. Tom?
Down as well. Yeah, John mentioned two groups. You don't even want to ask how many undocumented Argentines there are in South Florida, for example. You know why? Because they blend right into the white population. It's a big, it's a huge portion of Dade County, northern Dade County, Aventura, in that area. You'll find loads of undocumented Argentines. They never bother even getting stuff. They'll blend right in, and sooner or later they'll get their documents and off they go. Never will be found. But don't consider being an undocumented Haitian, right? Don't consider being. Argentines will tell you, no hay negros en Argentina. The same I heard from Cubans when I was a student. There are no Black people in Cuba. Fidel brought them in from the islands after we all left, right? So, and of course I said, well, who cooked your meals when you were in Cuba? Oh, Esmeralda. And Esmeralda was a white woman? No, she wasn't. Well, then explain your contradiction there. The contradictions are massive, right? When it comes to this sort of identity, and frankly, there's no way to fix it. You asked earlier, how can we avoid it? We can't avoid it. It's ingrained in our society. Some people will tell you not to avoid it. I choose not to insult people if I can. Some people don't care. Some people don't know that they're insulting people. That's well, in today's society, that's not surprising, right? So when it comes to anything like this, of identifying these categorizations, these simplistic categorizations is what they are. They allow us to understand our world. And in many cases,
they're very personal too, because it depends on how you self-identify. In many cases, it's not just, according to certain categories that are floating around out there, and then it is a personal decision in many cases. Not in all cases, but in some cases, it does have to do with the construction of oneself.
Who I think I am is nowhere near what you think I am. I'm betting. I would bet on that. Well, you and I don't even know each other, right?
Yeah, so, not before today.
Not before today. So John knows me, so he has an idea of who I am and how I identify and what I'm doing. But the interesting thing is that there's your perception of yourself, and then everybody else's perception of you. And that depends on the person you're talking to, right?
And this dictionary includes both. We had a person raise her hand during a presentation on this and say, do the people in this dictionary want to be called the terms that you have in it? And my guess is most times, no, they don't, because an insult is part of identity discourse. A racist category, a sexist category, a homophobic category is part of creating an identity. And the choice to come out of the closet, the choice to challenge this notion of identity, the choice to be an ally is also part of reinterpreting identity. The same thing that happened with race, affirmative notions of race being exported to Latin America, is happening right now with LGBTQ identity. If you go to Colombia, the resistance to accepting LGBTQ people is going to say the exact same thing. This is a US import with US identities, and this is distracting us from the Indians of the Amazon. And there's an expression in Portuguese that says, what does this butt have to do with these pants, right? Que tem a ver o cu com as calças? And so they'll create these false dichotomies of, if you loved our country, you would take care of our country. You wouldn't do this false foreign thing. And it's the intersection of gender and sexuality along with national identity.
It's always been undercurrent there, but it's been ignored or repressed. Always. I mean, this is nothing new. Nothing new.
John, Tom, it really is a pleasure chatting with you. And as we're, winding down the conversation, I have a couple more things that I would like to touch upon. And knowing that one of our common interests is literature, I'm wondering how important literature has been, or have you found that it has been when it comes to dealing with notions of identity? So in other words, how much is the literature regarding the idea of identity reflected on the pages of your dictionary?
I think literature does exactly what you were just talking about, Anton, or complicates things in the way that you mentioned. It is dangerous to reduce people to identity categories. There is a danger in reductivism, and literature pushes back at that. And so if you've got someone like Junot Diaz, right, who's writing about being Dominican in the United States, you're dealing with being a minority that's perceived as invisible. You're dealing with Blackness both in the United States and on the island. And so Junot Diaz is A Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde is a great example of making sure that if you say, oh, Dominicans have historically been in conflict with Haitians, it keeps us from reducing Haitians to a bunch of racists, because that life is more dynamic than that. Dominicans are more dynamic than that. And I think that Junot Diaz is a prime example of that, collaborating with Edwidge Dundicut from Haiti, who are creating different notions of that relationship between Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
Exactly. Jorge Amado was a wonderful example of the Brazilian writer who was hated by everybody by all the critics, but loved by the people. He was a font of useful information for this kind of stuff, because he described people in great detail. Great detail. He loved describing people, especially the swarthy woman, the beautiful dark-skinned woman who was supposed to be the essence of his Brazilian, right? That he comes to mind immediately. There are lots of others, but Amado is I just loved his work when I read it. So it's a key to the background. Since we're lexicographers here, but John's a literature person. I was trained as a literature person. I became a linguist, but we're both lexicographers. That's what we have. And we have a love of Spanish and Portuguese. And now we've kind of gotten over to the side of the French. And it's a love of language that's brought us here. We love expression. As you can tell from John, when he speaks, he loves language, right? In English or Portuguese or Spanish. It's self-evident in the way he talks. So that's why this is a work of passion for us.
Absolutely.
And that, I think it's something that we three share in common, the interest in language, which kind of opens the door to many other things, the literature, the culture, the landscape, the country, etc. And since you were talking about language and the fact that you come at this work from the point of view of lexicographers and linguists and that kind of thing, of course you're dealing with Spanish, with French, with Portuguese. The book is, however, written in English. Is there any specific reason why you decided to write this book in English and not, say, in Spanish or Portuguese, which, are languages that you do have perfect command of?
Thank you for the question. I want to go back to your previous question about literature, because I'm having fun just opening random pages. I love discovering new things and remembering what we wrote here. We've got two terms right next to one another. We've got negrito curro, okay, defined as little black pimp. Then we got negrito de salir, black leaving or black trying to leave. Okay, these two terms for Afro-Cubans in both cases come from Fernando Ortiz and from Domingo del Monte, right? The guy who's responsible for the only slave narrative in Latin America, if you use the abolitionist terminology. And so Domingo del Monte is going to be an example of literary discourse. But Fernando Ortiz, is that literature or is that the social sciences? Mm-hmm. The answer is yes.
You could argue that he's an anthropologist philosopher. And you could argue that philosophy is often fiction, or it seems as if it is. Right? I agree with you. I agree with you. It's where does the line? Where is that line?
Yeah, and there doesn't necessarily have to be a line, as you say, between literature and philosophy, because if you think of the the dialogues of Plato, I mean, there's a lot of literature in there. So obviously, yeah, I think that's absolutely, I totally agree with that.
So you want to answer the other question now, John?
Yes. Why is it in English? There are,
and I want to say before you say that I don't present this question as an accusatory question in any way. I'm just interested in why you choose a specific language over another.
Well, this is going to be very useful to U.S. historians, U.S. social scientists, anthropologists, the people from these disciplines that we were just talking about. We were lucky enough to get the support of the University of Florida Press, which markets in the United States. So I think that it's going to be something that is going to increase understanding across a variety of fields in the United States. The United States, for better or worse, has become a center for Latin American studies since the Cuban Revolution. And that's why I say for better or worse. We became very interested in the Caribbean when we were almost blown off the face of the earth by nuclear missiles. And so much like the recent interest in Arabic language and studies in the Middle East, there are U.S. strategic interests there, and that history is a very real thing. That doesn't mean that all Latin Americanist scholarship is an imperialist venture by any means. If anything, this is also the center of human rights advocacy around the world. And so many of the exiles of Latin America, of these dictatorships that resulted from the Cold War, they're here as well. So the English language is going to reach the Latin Americans of the United States. It's also a lingua franca in Europe. So this is going to be a useful dictionary throughout Europe. So maybe someone's first language is German, but they read English well, then this is going to be a tool that's going to be useful in a wide variety of contexts.
it would be strange on time to translate this back to Spanish because in many cases we probably don't have the original Spanish versions of what was written in English. I mean, I guess we would have to go back and reconstruct that from all the bibliography that we have. So that would be very strange. But we have a lot of stuff. We have a lot of stuff that we could reconstruct if we wanted to. I don't think it serves any purpose. I think it's mostly a waste of time to go back and do that now. And you have to remember too that all these terms that you brought this up, all these terms have been filtered through two Anglophones from the South. And I think that it has to color the way that, in the fun, it colors the way we view these racial terminologies. Are we woke? I don't know. Maybe we are woke. Are we more liberal than others? Perhaps we are. But I think the one thing that John and I both have in common is practicality. So if they were using the N-word, John insisted we use the N-word itself and not euphemism, the N-word. If it was equivalent, it was equivalent. You'll see that in the dictionary. So we may get zapped for that, but at the same time, we're very honest to ourselves and our audience. We want people to understand where we're coming from. We're not hiding behind any veil. That people want to look us up, we're right there.
Yeah, the ethical questions are myriad when you write a work like this. Should one say the N-word? I don't use this in my daily life, but why would we elude or erase that word, but not the word, any number of insults for gay people, right? In many countries, in many regions, there was no polite or objective or affirming term for a gay person, right? So why would I not say this one cruel, horrible word, but use all these other cruel, horrible words? Because we're describing a lot of violence. I mean, the notion of identity as an affirmative thing, something that makes you feel better, that makes you feel part of a group, as a global phenomenon is very, very recent, and it's still something that's full of conflicts. So that's why a term like that that we've chosen to treat with great taboo in the United States, because it evokes that history of segregation and oppression. We've decided to not use taboo as a way to make this accessible. We're leaving the violent words in there. We're leaving the violence of history in there, because that's the attempt at objectivity that we have made, even though we are highly aware that objectivity is impossible. Is if an enslaver is talking to an enslaved person and he uses a racial slur in his context, I'm not going to update that to African American, for example.
And I really appreciate you doing that in the dictionary, because I feel like in many ways when you're writing a work like this, when you're trying to portray reality, you can't just step away from reality and evade reality, because you are basically working with something that actually has happened, is happening, is part of reality, and you are recording that by means of writing a dictionary. And this really leads me into my final question for the two of you. As a kid and a teenager, I used to collect dictionaries, usually dictionaries of foreign languages that I didn't speak and that I still don't speak, many of them. Some of them I do, some of them don't. But in any case, that obviously didn't make me the coolest kid on the block, but it was something that I've always been attracted to, dictionaries about different languages, because language is a passion for me, as it is for the two of you. But we are in an age right now, after the internet has exploded into our daily lives and has colored our daily lives and existences, really, in which many people think that everything can be found on the internet. And so I'm wondering, what do you think the role of a print dictionary, not just like yours, but just a print dictionary in general, what do you think its role is in the present day? I know it's a difficult question, maybe, but I really didn't want to close our conversation without asking you all this.
Mhm. I'd like for Tom to talk a little bit more about our plans to digitize this and the digital edition that's coming out. But I think that I collect dictionaries too. So I guess, Anton, we're a couple of nerds that found each other. But I have a library dictionary in the other office over here, for example. And something that I like about a print dictionary, well, there are two things. For one thing, it supports libraries because you have to go to a library to consult it. And I think that libraries nationwide are threatened on multiple levels. You've got local public libraries that are being defunded, and you've got state universities. Their funding has diminished since 2007, at least. It really started in the early 2000s. Students see this as their tuition costs going up, and we see it as cuts to the humanities typically. So anything that supports libraries is a good thing in my mind. As an individual, though, I like serendipity. I like opening up a book, just like I did a couple of times so far, and learning something completely unexpected. So I'm going to do this now. We've got Indio chontal, okay? I don't use this word in normal conversation, and so I just learned Indio chontal is a Carib Indian who supposedly was cannibalistic and warrior-like. So chontal, that's not a word I use every day. That's something that I just learned. I think that with a print dictionary, you can discover things without things being fed to you. I think that currently in the context of Netflix and Hulu and streaming devices, analogs make decisions for us based on our previous decisions. And that takes out an element of serendipity that I think a print work leads in.
Hence, I got to Jordan Peterson today.
And in that sense, you know, that reminds me of, you know, one of my favorite novels by Wilkie Collins is A Rogue's Life, and it's not very well known. I didn't know it myself, but I was looking for another novel at the library at Vanderbilt one time, and I came across A Rogue's Life, and I never would have come across it if I hadn't gone there in person and looked for it. So not looking for it, I mean looking for something else and coming across that.
Serendipity. I was gifted a Tagalog English dictionary back in the 1960s when I was a high school kid. And I kept that dictionary for many, many years until I found somebody who would actually use it. I kept it. It was given to me by a man in my hometown who had been stationed in the Philippines. And I was fascinated by this thing. It was, you know, it was in English. But I noticed that lots of words looked like Spanish. And so I began making these connections as a green behind the ears, budding language person. It was fun. Dictionaries are fun. That's the bottom line.
I absolutely agree. And Tom, do let us know about those plans to digitize this Dictionary of Latin American Identities.
They're in the works. It's in the works. I've got some feelers out. We definitely want to digitize this and make it more. I'm sure the University of Florida Press is going to want to monetize it, but sooner or later it goes out of monetization, and then it'll be free. So at some point, that's probably where it will be. They need to make their money. I get it. I want them to. It's the right thing to do, and they've been very, very generous with John and me over the past 3 years, helping and kindness. Lots of kindness there. We were amazed at how kind they were, which is not usual with many presses.
I do hope that can come to fruition, and until then, we have this print form dictionary that has over 900 pages. 900 pages. It's called the Dictionary of Latin American Identities, published by the University of Florida Press, hot off the presses, and their authors have been with us here on the written page for the last, well, over an hour of conversation that we've been having here. John T. Maddox and Thomas M. Stevens. John, Tom, very quickly tell me what you're working on right now. If you have anything in the works, anything that you're studying and maybe writing, you know, that's in the works, Tell us a little bit about that, and we'll close with that.
Preparing a dictionary never ends, right, John?
That's right.
Go ahead. I just interrupted. Go ahead, John.
Right. It never ends. I currently have a book of literary criticism that I'm working on called Fractal Families, where this dynamic of family that we've been talking about as part of colonialism, part of race and gender, is part of challenging the great Puerto Rican family. So they imagine the island as a big happy family based on the plantation, problematically. And Black female writers from the new millennium are challenging that, taking that family apart and showing how new families of choice, fractal families, like you think about gay people that form families of choice in new communities, how they recreate new communities through their fiction. And of course, Tom and I are continuing this long, long journey together of the Dictionary of Latin American Identities.
We are. We'll have the electronic edition hopefully in the next year or so, and we'll be working on a second edition, working more with adding French and the various creoles. I am working on a book with my colleague Mary Macris at the University of Louisville called Convenient Untruths, about many of the narratives that we get regarding race in literature, in media, in cartoons, on television, in this country and elsewhere. The whole Speedy Gonzales narrative that I grew up with as a kid watching the Speedy Gonzales cartoons. The issue of the blackface and the Mexican stamps that hit the airwaves a few years ago. All kinds of things like that. That's what she and I are working on. And also, as he said, we're still working on I've got another 35 or 40 pages of bibliography already for us to work on, John. Get ready.
Looking forward to it.
I know you are.
Well, I wish the two of you best of luck in your academic and creative endeavors, and I appreciate your being here. I've had a wonderful time chatting with the two of you today on the written page, and whenever any of that work comes out, and if you want to come back, well, you're invited to come back and talk about anything you feel like talking here on the written page. And for now, I just want to thank you for joining us today on a new episode of the written page on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Thank you so much, John and Tom, and hope to see you again real soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anton. Always a pleasure. Take care. Thanks, Tom.
Bye, Anton. I really appreciate it. Nice to meet you, friend.
Nice to meet you too. And this has been a new edition of the written page on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and our guests today were John T. Maddox and Thomas M. Stevens. Please check out their Dictionary of Latin American Identities, just published by the University of Florida Press. Mine is the copyright of this video that was recorded in Martin, in the state of Tennessee, in the United States of America, in the month of August of the year 2021. And of course, the copyright also belongs to John Maddox and Thomas Stevens. Thank you very much for joining us for a new episode of The Written Page. And if you have any comments, any questions, make sure to leave them underneath the video, which will very soon be available on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. As always, thanks for everything, and so long, everybody.